Okay, let us begin to make a start. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Many thanks for joining us today from different parts of the world. I do see that more people are gradually connecting, but in the interest of time and given that we have quite a lot to cover today, let us make a start. My name is Katie Jones, and I'm working with the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, UIL, on various topics, including the recognition, validation, and accreditation of non-formal and informal learning, as well as lifelong learning policy support. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar titled Lifelong Learning Entitlements from Vision to Action, which forms part of UIL's global webinar series titled Unlocking the Power of Lifelong Learning. I will be moderating today's session, which has been co-organised with our colleagues at UNESCO headquarters. Today, we will dive into the topic of lifelong learning entitlements, also known as LLLEs, considering how these mechanisms can help to guarantee access to lifelong learning opportunities as a human right for all, and how they may connect to national level lifelong learning policies. In particular, during this webinar, we are delighted to celebrate the launch of a new publication titled Lifelong Learning Entitlements from Design to Impact, Cases of Australia, Canada, France, Ireland, Singapore, and the Republic of Korea. Developed by a number of expert co-authors and our colleagues at UNESCO headquarters, this publication explores how lifelong learning entitlements can be designed and implemented to create impact via case study research. We do have a very exciting agenda ahead of us today. Following some opening remarks, we will first learn more about this new report, hearing from one of its co-authors during an insightful presentation, followed by a quick-fire chat. We will then take a closer look at the efforts of one country in this area in the framework of its broader approach to lifelong learning, and that country is the Philippines. UIL has been working closely with representatives from the Philippines recently in relation to their efforts to drive forward lifelong learning policy at the national level. Following these interventions, we will then have some time for Q&A and discussion before closing. Before we begin, I would like to share 3 technical points with you all. So first, please do feel free to share any questions you may have for our speakers throughout today's session in the Q&A box. Now, you should see the Q&A function in the Zoom menu bar at the bottom of your screen. Secondly, you may wish to use the chat box to say hello and let us know where you are joining from today, or to share any reflections you may have in relation to today's main topic of lifelong learning entitlements. And finally, please note that today's session is being recorded and will soon be available to watch back on UIL's website. So, without further ado, let us begin. And to open our session, I'm very pleased to hand over the floor to Mr. Boren Chakroun, who is the Director of the Division for Policies and Lifelong Learning Systems at UNESCO. So Boren is an engineer with a PhD in Education Sciences from Bourgogne University in France. He worked during the 1990s as a trainer, chief trainer, and project manager. He has also worked as a short-term consultant for the EU, World Bank, and other international organisations before going to the European Training Foundation, ETF, in 2001. At the ETF, Boren worked as a senior human capital development specialist, and he is now director of the Policies and Lifelong Learning Systems Division at UNESCO headquarters. Boren has conducted a range of policy reviews and skill systems diagnoses in different contexts. He has authored and co-authored various articles and books in the field of skills development and lifelong learning. Much of his recent work focuses on the global trends in reforming education and training systems, as well as the global agenda for skills development in the context of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Boren, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katie, and happy to see you. Happy to see all colleagues who are joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I see colleagues from different parts of the world, and this is a matter of proud and really interest from our side. And thank you all for joining us. Let me start by saying happy Human Rights Day. It's a very important moment for us. It's important to celebrate the day, but to celebrate it to reflect on what we have achieved since the adoption of the human rights, and what we need to further address, and what are the barriers that are preventing us from making progress, but also to have this, I would say, foresight work on looking at how the human rights, in particular, the right to education within lifelong learning is evolving, and what we need to take into consideration in this discussion. And obviously, Katie, what you are referring to, the lifelong learning entitlements, are a central piece in this discussion, but there are other aspects, of course, that are important to take into consideration. Now, if you allow me, I would like to place this work and the launch of the report that we are in a way publishing today in the context. I think since many years we have been looking at the right to education from a much broader perspective. When we adopted the Convention on the Non-Discrimination Education in 1960, half of the children were not going to school of the world. Today, we have achieved rather almost universal access to education, at least to basic education. But we have seen challenges in terms of the quality of the learning and education, its outcomes. And increasingly, there are new factors that are affecting the way we look at the right to education. Digitalization, climate change, demographies, fabric of the economic fabrics, and obviously the question on how societies are evolving, the challenge in terms of democratic participation, inequities within and across societies. So those are new factors that are affecting the way we consider the right to education, and we consider its different component. And in 2022, and after the COVID, UNESCO organized, I would say, a year of lifelong learning. We started, of course, from the Transforming Education Summit, but we had also the Confintia organized by UIL on adult learning. We had the conference on higher education. We had a conference on early child education and care. So we have considered the lifelong learning within that broader perspective. And we have understood that, and I think we got a consensus, an international consensus around the importance of evolving a right to education and place it within a lifelong learning perspective. So that's a matter that is shaping this agenda together with these factors that I'm mentioning. Today, the point is to understand where the landscape is evolving and what are the directions that some countries are taking. And Katie, you referred to some of the countries that are covered by the report. And obviously is how you give every citizen the right to opportunities for learning, and how we turn these opportunities into realities. And one of the instruments that we have seen is the lifelong learning entitlements, and I will come back to that. But there are other aspects that we have also examined, is the validation and recognition of prior learning, and how we validate learning that is happening in different settings, how we acknowledge and recognize and value this learning. There are other aspects related to the work status, and how your work status contract can allow you for having opportunities for learning. And the other one is about how you bring to the learners the opportunities for learning. And that's, for example, the digital transformation with the digital divide that we see. The last maybe element that is very important in our discussion, and it relates to the work that UIL is leading, is how you take a national policy to a local action. And that's, for example, our network of learning cities, with more than 420 now cities that are learning cities. And that means how you, I would say, deploy those capacities and opportunities for learning and for lifelong learning at a local level, and make that accessible. So these are some of the, I would say, direction that we are taking. Today, we are discussing the lifelong learning entitlements because, first of all, we have seen recent developments in many countries in the world, Some of them, Katie, what you mentioned, France, we have seen in Singapore, in Australia, in Korea, in Canada, in some provinces. We have seen some countries including in their constitution the right to lifelong learning or the right to vocational training throughout life. That's a country like Morocco. So we have seen this progress. And we have seen, I would say, development of instruments and mechanisms like the lifelong learning entitlements. What we didn't see, and that's what this report has been focusing on, is what is the output and what is the outcome when a country is setting up a lifelong learning entitlement. Does it serve the most disadvantaged group? Does it lead to better access to jobs or to better participation in societies? The wider benefit of lifelong learning entitlements. What evaluations are telling us about how these mechanisms are working? The scale of participation, and we have mapped around 3.8 million learners who have benefited from lifelong learning entitlements. So moving from, I would say, description of how these mechanisms work, how they are funded, how they are regulated, which target group they are in a way targeting, to looking at what is the output and the outcomes. And that's what I think we need to discuss, and we continue taking this forward. Now, I would like to finish with saying that yesterday at the headquarters, at UNESCO headquarters in Paris, we have celebrated also the right to education. We had a symposium on the right to education and the evolving nature of the right to education. And I must say that it was very important for us to say it's time for us to reconsider the way we look at the right to education and place it within a lifelong learning perspective. And there was a consensus in the room. And I'm sure that we will have a consensus also in our webinar today regarding the importance of placing the right to education and the lifelong learning entitlements as part of this ecosystem of the rights. But also we spoke about the intersection between the right to education and other human rights. And it's very important. It's also a right to information. It's a right to economic rights. It's cultural rights. So it's very important that we think it also within the broader ecosystem of lifelong learning, but also within the broader ecosystem of human rights. And I hope that our discussion today will help us advance our agenda and achieve what we want all to achieve, to give each and every person the opportunities to continue learning and to benefit from the wider benefit of learning and lifelong learning. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you, Katie, and all colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Boren, for kindly sharing your insights and reflections with us. Your intervention has helped to set the stage very well for the presentations and exchanges to follow today. And just to say, it's very, very special and quite an honor to be able to have this webinar and to celebrate the new publication launch on such a special day, Human Rights Day. Many thanks once again. So without further ado, let us now take a deeper dive into the new publication on lifelong learning entitlements. So to do this, I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Michael Fung, who is the lead author of the report, and Michael will be presenting its key findings. So Michael is the executive director of the Institute for the Future of Education, IFE, at Tecnológico de Monterrey, and he is leading the university's efforts to create and disseminate and apply research-based educational innovation to transform higher education and lifelong learning worldwide. He previously held roles as Deputy Chief Executive at Skills Future Singapore, founding president of the Higher Education Planning in Asia Association, and he serves on various global boards and committees. Michael is an alumnus of the University of Southern California and Carnegie Mellon University in the United States of America, and Tsinghua University in the People's Republic of China. Now, following his 8-minute presentation, Michael will be joined by Miss Claudia Pompa, who is a program specialist at the section of youth literacy and skills development under the Division for Policies and Lifelong Learning Systems at UNESCO headquarters, for a quick fire exchange to dive deeper into key themes that emerge in the publication. So just to share a little bit about Claudia as well. So Claudia is an education program specialist in the section for youth literacy and skills development at UNESCO. And in this role, she is leading policy relevant research and overseeing cross-regional initiatives focused on skills development and TVET. Her expertise spans the future of work, workforce development, labour markets, and economic growth. With over 18 years of experience as an international development consultant and technical advisor, Claudia has worked across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. She has designed, implemented, and evaluated complex development programs, often integrating private sector engagement strategies across government, multilateral, and non-profit organizations. So we will be diving straight into that quickfire chat following Michael's presentation. But for now, Michael, you have 8 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. And thanks to colleagues at UNESCO for the opportunity to work on this study. I also want to thank my co-authors, Simon Freebody, Annie Carmel, and Sheng Yizhe for their work on the case studies in this report. Next slide, please. Next, yeah, okay, great. So given a limited time, I'm not going to cover all the details in the slides, but let me just give you highlights of the slides as an introduction to the report that we have written. So we look at lifelong learning entitlements. It's set in the context with the recognition that lifelong learning is key for sustainable development. And given the rapid disruptions that we're seeing, it's turned out to be a promising way to help our workforce and our population to navigate these disruptions. And it requires supportive policies, investments in developing learning ecosystems that will help to support lifelong learning. And the emergence of lifelong learning entitlements across different countries in the world shows that it is a promising policy instrument, and it helps to accomplish the vision of lifelong learning as a fundamental human right. Next slide, please. For this research study, we've picked a number of countries to do a deep dive on the case studies. This builds on the work that was done by a UNESCO team on the national legal frameworks across the world in the provision of lifelong learning entitlements. And the case studies do not currently include developing countries because none of their initiatives meet the selection criteria for the case studies, but it incorporates certain examples from developing countries' experiences to provide insights into relevant frameworks and interventions. As part of the research study, we conducted a comprehensive literature review and conducted 22 expert interviews with government representatives, academics, training providers, and so on, to help us to triangulate findings on the implementation and success of different systems. Overall, the findings from the studies underscore important policy considerations, and that would serve as relevant information for policymakers in both developing and developed nations to look at the introduction and the operation of lifelong learning entitlements. Next slide, please. Here are the 6 countries that we conducted in-depth case studies on: Australia, Canada, France, Ireland, Republic of Korea, and Singapore. And in terms of the entitlements, there are several different types, including subsidies, vouchers for learning, and individual learning accounts. Next slide, please. So here, let me give you a very quick snapshot of the key features of each of the country case studies, and more details can be found in the report. In Australia, there are state-level subsidies for training and technical and vocational education and training. And learners have the flexibility to choose from their preferred courses and providers. And the lifelong learning entitlement system that was developed there saw an initial significant increase in enrollment. However, mixed results emerged as the system operated due to rising costs and fraud issues, and substantial reforms have been prompted as a result from the Australian case study. In the case of Canada, federal tax credits in the form of Canadian tax credits system, CTC, was offered, and this provided near universal coverage for all taxpayers. Although what we've seen is that the utilization rates are still relatively low in Canada, and we've seen higher use amongst high income groups as well, which is not intended policy objective of the Canadian tax credit. In France, that's the country that has the individual learning account, perhaps the only country that has a fully operating individual learning account system. Successive reforms have led to increased usage. The initial periods of the system didn't have strong usage, but successive reforms have helped to increase the usage. A very promising feature of the France system is the strong uptake amongst disadvantaged groups, a feature that is quite relevant, but also quite special about the system that's been implemented in France. Along the way, before the reforms, there were substantial challenges due to fraudulent claims, and that undermined the system's effectiveness and continues to be an issue that needs to be closely worked on in the French system. Next slide, please. In Ireland, there are a couple of lifelong learning entitlement systems, e-college and Springboard Plus. And these efforts provide for flexible enrollment into courses that are recognized by the industry. And because of the flexible enrollment system, it allows for diverse learners to be accommodated within the system. And as I mentioned, the qualifications are well recognized by the industry with strong employer collaboration and engagement, and also rigorous quality assurance mechanisms put in place. However, due to the limited funding that is allocated to these initiatives, there's some degree of unmet demand in Ireland for lifelong learning. In South Korea, a voucher system, the National Learning Card, provides near universal coverage across the population for access to a range of vocational courses. What we've seen in Korea is modest participation despite the near universal coverage and some concerns around the quality of the training courses that are provided. We've seen that the Korean system seems to be popular with younger working population, which is an interesting characteristic of the system in Korea. Now, the final case study is on Singapore. The voucher system provided through SkillsFuture Credit gives a wide, extensive range of lifelong learning support across more than 20,000 courses with a good variety of these courses. The uptake has been seen to be moderate despite the extensive support and extensive courses. And there are also challenges with fraud with a few substantial cases that happened in the years that it was introduced. Next slide, please. So as I said, more details in the report. If I were to try to bridge across all the different systems that we have studied, let me share with you some of the key achievements that we have observed in the lifelong learning entitlement systems. First is that the lifelong learning entitlement systems appear to be able to increase the level of motivation for lifelong learning. And we've seen some of that, for example, in Korea, where it is popular among the young people because it seems they are motivated to have a good pathway to transition to employment. In Ireland, the job placements, due to the close engagement with employers, is also making the upskilling attractive, lifelong learning attractive in that context. And post the 2018 reform of the system in France, we've seen a large uptake in the participation rate for lifelong learning. The second key achievement is around flexibility and equity through flexible learning options such as online MOOCs, stackable courses, and so on in Singapore and Ireland. We've seen a good degree of flexibility provided compared to traditional educational models. In a number of countries like Korea, France, and Canada, we have seen interventions and mechanisms that brings about greater levels of equity for lifelong learning. through fee waivers, through access, and so on. Quality assurance is another area that I think we've observed across a number of countries, turns out to be extremely important to uphold the reputation and the integrity of the system. So there are continuous improvements, quality improvement systems that we observe in Singapore, using feedback from learners in implementation of quality frameworks. And also same case could be said about Ireland and in Canada as well. And finally, the other achievements is in the area of skills matching that helps to bridge towards employability and employment. And we've seen targeted subsidies provided in several countries, including Korea and Ireland, to help to bridge skills gaps that the industry is facing and requiring. Next slide, please. As we also look at these different systems, I want to talk about some of the key implementation challenges we've observed. On this slide is a generic program logic for lifelong learning entitlements, where we go from phase 0 of defining the policy objectives and design to making the entitlement available, publicizing it, generating demand from participants, getting the training providers to provide the training, and forming the skills, and then monitoring and evaluating the system. This slide also points out a number of key challenges to the program logic, and I will talk about some of them in the next slide. Next slide, please. Sorry, previous slide. Sorry, I think there may have been one missing slide in between, so let me just talk through it in this slide. So first, in the phase 0 on defining policy objective and design, we have seen in a number of countries that ambiguous objectives of the lifelong learning entitlement led to conflicting implementation in a number of systems. The second major challenge is around procedural complexities, and the implementation of lifelong learning entitlements is both complex and requires good administrative coordination. And so these complexities could also be a key challenge in the implementation of such systems. The third area is on demand formation. That's the third challenge. What we have also observed is that financial incentives alone is insufficient to generate the desired behaviors on the parts of participants. And we need to support them with additional communication, additional supporting mechanisms, and so on. And the fourth challenge is around market failures and information asymmetry. Just by generating the supply of training and also providing entitlements does not mean that individuals are aware of the system. And so more work has to be done in ensuring that the features of the system, the way to the leverage on the entitlement, that these pieces of information is well communicated to the targeted audience. The fifth challenge is around fraud risk. Again, we've seen fraudulent behaviors amongst commercially driven training providers in a number of countries. And so strong quality assurance mechanisms is certainly required to ensure that the system operates as intended. And finally, a very important challenge is around the equitable outcomes that the system tries to accomplish. And we have observed in a number of systems that those who are they're better educated and in more advantaged situations tend to have a high uptake in terms of lifelong learning. And this further reinforces the Matthew effects of these systems. Again, more needs to be done to ensure greater levels of equity in terms of the outcomes of lifelong learning entitlement systems. Next slide, please. So a final couple of slides. So a few key policy recommendations that we've summed up from the report. First is to ensure that we clarify the objectives, ensure that there's clear and coherent goals, streamline the administration, simplify the procedures, and strengthen the coordination. Assess demand characteristics to understand the learner segments and motivations alongside the program rollout. enhance communication and outreach, as I mentioned, to the public, disseminate information and conduct awareness campaigns, leverage on digital platforms and quality assurance systems to ensure robust quality of the interventions that are provided, and to strengthen fraud prevention through measures such as identity verification and also accreditation of training providers. And to provide targeted support, additional assistance, as I mentioned, such as training allowances or childcare support for learners from disadvantaged environments and backgrounds. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I've given you a very quick overview of the report on lifelong learning entitlements. We've seen the importance of the way it's designed and implemented to ensuring success of the systems, of the entitlement systems. And we've also talked about how lifelong learning is now more a social imperative and an economic imperative, more so now than ever before due to the disruptions we're seeing. And as policy instruments, lifelong learning entitlements are a promising tool to ensure the provision of learning opportunities throughout life. And it requires integration within a larger lifelong learning ecosystem to be effective, and quality and equity remain as crucial considerations for any lifelong learning entitlement systems that are to be implemented in developing and also developed nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for a great presentation. We can say that it has been quite a journey to get here today to the launch of this publication. Thank you again to you and your team for all of the hard work. And I wanted to take this moment now to ask you a few questions, and then maybe we can reflect a little bit deeper in some aspects of lifelong learning entitlements and what are some of the lessons learned from this process. I know there must be a lot of questions in people's minds about this, and we invite them to read the document. Our colleagues have just put the link in the chat, and we will also be sharing the video recording of this conversation. But Michael, when we address this issue of targeting versus choice, many programs have the challenge of having to balance individual choice versus needs to address inequalities, but also needs of the labor market. So I was wondering, what design features do you think are critical or essential to ensure that lifelong learning entitlements really target those that are needed the most, basically the low income, low skills, or precarious workers?
Yes, thank you, Claudia. And certainly thanks to you and the team for your excellent support in putting together this report. It has indeed taken us some time, and I'm very pleased that it's come to its final conclusion and publication. So you raised a very important question about targeting versus choice in terms of segments of the population that we are benefiting through lifelong learning entitlements. Let me suggest to you that all segments of the population requires lifelong learning, even those that are well educated or in privileged positions, because their skills are being disrupted rapidly by changes in industry. However, we know that those who are in privileged positions typically have options of pursuing learning and so on. So we're particularly concerned about the segments of population that are vulnerable, they're underprivileged. And our research, indeed, as I mentioned earlier, suggests that we're seeing the Matthew effect in different countries. And this aligns with my experience in Singapore as well, where those who are better educated with more financial resources are consuming more in terms of lifelong learning entitlements. So one of the things that policymakers can do is to consider providing differentiated subsidies. It does make the system more complicated, but by providing higher levels of subsidies for those who are vulnerable and from low-income groups, for example, and also for maybe small, medium-sized enterprises that are supporting their employees for upskilling and reskilling, we can shift some of this behavior, making it even, lowering the barriers even further for those in vulnerable segments. Policymakers could also consider specific targeted programs that are contextualized for these vulnerable groups and disadvantaged groups that are being served and being helped. By also improving accessibility, I think that's another way of bringing more equity to lifelong learning systems. I think in Australia, the TAFE system, community colleges in a number of countries make learning much more accessible to different segments of population. Community centers in a number of countries could also be leveraged to bring learning much closer to the populations across the country. Finally, there's a mechanism that I think is perhaps worth referring to, which is a progressive wage learning model that has been implemented in Singapore, where learning is tied with wage increases. And these wage ladders, if you would, is defined for a number of professions that are associated with low income professions. So that it provides a pathway for these segments to continue to learn and to improve in their economic mobility as they go through those learning. Back to you,
Great.
Claudia.
I think that there's a lot to unpack already there and a lot to think about, particularly for policymakers, because I find this topic quite fascinating and there are so many aspects that we can take from it. And I also wanted to question or perhaps hear your thoughts about, how do we do this in very constrained contexts? How do we implement lifelong learning entitlements? Most of our cases are, of course, and we acknowledge that, from developed countries or wealthy countries, while developing countries are also looking at different options. The report does raise the issue that perhaps targeted lifelong learning initiatives might be more useful in developing countries rather than broad entitlements, but it's something to consider. But how can developing countries that have really tight fiscal spaces and lower capacity perhaps for implementation, taking into account procedural complexities, can implement these type of policies? And perhaps, and most importantly, how do we ensure that they don't become just very niche policies, but that there is broad coverage and they go from pilots to scale?
Well, Claudia, you asked another really excellent question, and perhaps I could say it's still a question that requires, the defining of effective solutions. Indeed, providing universal lifelong learning entitlements is a very costly move from a fiscal perspective, because such broad-based benefits is going to require significant financial resources. And in many developing countries that are already in some way struggling with investments in basic formal education, this seems to be a very high barrier to overcome, right? So indeed, it is very costly. I think that in the context of developing countries, there is no choice. Maybe there's always a choice, but I think perhaps I should say a good choice will be to start small. If you start by providing broad-based benefits, it's going to dilute the efforts, it's going to require a lot of money, and perhaps there's limited economic outcomes that can be produced because of the broad-based effect of the funding. So having some kind of targeted program level funding as a start is helpful. We see that, for example, like in Ireland, that's been very targeted towards economic employers' needs, and they've been quite successful. And use these targeted programs to establish some kind of momentum, a proof of concept of how it works in working through the coordination mechanisms that would then allow for scaling later on into a much more comprehensive system. And in many ways, that's the approach that we have observed in countries like Australia, Korea, and Singapore as well, where there were much more targeted workforce skills development programs before the introduction of a universal lifelong learning entitlement system. This gives countries time to demonstrate economic impact, return on investment that will justify higher levels of investment in lifelong learning. Eventually, it can be then scaled to broad-based support, as I mentioned, along with building a culture of lifelong learning. I think also in the context of developing countries, there is good potential to leverage on other sources of funding. So think about it as a funding mix, not just in the traditional sources of funding, including possibly introduction of skills levies as a source of funding, direct government subventions, which is challenging because of the size of the requirements, but also mobilizing the private sector and employers to contribute towards lifelong learning opportunities because it does benefit them eventually. Skilled labor force helps them to be more competitive and do better in the business. I think corporate foundations, NGOs, and a source of funding as well. So not an easy answer, but mobilize multiple sources of funding to support initial targeted program implementation, and over time mobilize more support, given the successes that you see, into a much more broad-based system. Back to you.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for those very comprehensive but at the same time, very useful questions. I think very practical. As we mentioned, we could spend days and hours talking about lifelong learning entitlements. There is a lot to unpack, but we just have a short hour. So I will give the floor back to Katie so that she can introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael, for your comprehensive presentation and also for joining us so early where you are, and also to both Michael and Claudia for that really insightful exchange. You raised key points around targeting versus choice, ways to engage diverse target groups, and also challenges like fraud and quality issues. So it was also great to see the different approaches by the countries that were mentioned, but all seem to be very practical. And again, I think that key point around financial incentives alone not being enough and the need for these complementary measures. So many thanks again to you both. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's Country Spotlight segment. We will now hear from Mr. Florencio F. Sunico Jr., Regional Director of the Technical Education and Skills Development Authority, TESDA, Caraga, in the Philippines. Mr. Sunico will share experiences from his country's efforts to advance lifelong learning entitlements and lifelong learning as a human right more broadly. Mr. Florencio Sunico Jr. is a career executive officer holding the position of Regional Director of TESDA, the Philippines' Tibet agency. He's been working in government for the last 40 years, often representing TESDA in various Tibet conferences, especially in the Asian region. His area of interest revolves around workforce development and Tibet. He is TESDA's chair of the Human Resource Development Committee and co-chair of the Lifelong Learning Working Group of the Philippine Qualifications Framework National Coordinating Council, the PQF-NCC Secretariat. Recently, together with other representatives from the Philippines, he participated in the UIL Shanghai Open University Capacity Building Workshop on strengthening education systems from a lifelong learning perspective. So, Mr. Sunico, you have 8 minutes. The floor is yours, and we will be very happy to share your slides on the screen.
Thank you, Miss Katie. Good evening, everyone from the Philippines. Okay. So let me begin by sharing some thoughts about why we consider lifelong learning as a human right. Next, please. I thought of lifelong learning as a human right from two perspectives. Number one, it's essential for personal growth and human flourishing, what the ancient Greeks would call eudaimonia. So lifelong learning enables individuals across all ages and various groups, regardless of circumstances, to grow, to develop, and evolve into the best version of what they could be, what we could be. And the second is as a fundamental to social or societal progress, lifelong learning ensures that individuals are provided the means and opportunities to economic security, social inclusion, active citizenship, and sustainable development. Guaranteeing these two together ensures the fulfillment and purpose of the principle enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for all ages and stages of life. Next, please. Now, our long years efforts of putting all aspects of our programs and initiatives in lifelong learning under one big umbrella has led us into this framework, which was finally enacted, no, signed by the president in October this year. And this new law amends the Philippine Qualifications Framework, strengthens the National Coordinating Council. It's important to note that the Minister of Local Government is now being included, and that signifies that important component of learning cities, no, expansion of the learning localities, in fact, down to the barangay level. Provides funding support, as has been discussed earlier, and most important, articulate a definitive policy on what lifelong learning constitutes for the Philippines. So among the key features of this new act, it promotes continuous learning. It guarantees equal opportunities, inclusive education, strengthens, like I said, the PQF, empowers the local government units, expands access and technology, and encourages relevance among others. Next, please. Okay. Our programs, this may not be what the context of the report described earlier, no, is, but we're close to that. The closest that we could cite as our entitlements, LLE entitlements in the Philippines. In fact, it's based on a law. We call it the Unified Student Financial Assistance System for Tertiary, or UNIFAST. And this harmonizes, rationalizes, and expands all government-funded student financial assistance programs such as scholarships, grants in aid, and student loans under one body, which is lodged under our Minister of Higher Education. There is also the universal, and these are all laws, no, in the Philippines, the universal access to quality tertiary education, which also provides and strengthens the UNIFAS system by expanding the scope and coverage of the student financial assistance. In my agency, which is TESDA, we also have training or scholarship grants available for job-specific sectors. And although this is given to the school providers rather than as an incentive to the learner. So, and therefore, what we hope to do as we come up with a master plan for the lifelong learning, next please, the Lifelong Learning Development Framework Act, no, and implementing rules and regulation in the next 90 days as provided for in the act is to align, no, this these initiatives and programs into the lifelong learning entitlements as brought about by the case study. And there's a bright promise and great opportunity that we can do this as we move to craft, no, the implementing rules and regulation. It is, by the way, mandated in the law to provide uh, financial subsidy, no, to lifelong learning programs and initiatives down to the lowest local government unit in the barangay. No, in fact, from both formal to informal and non-formal. So I'll end there, and thank you, Miss Katie. I hope I have not gone beyond my 8-minute limit. Thank you for giving us this chance to voice our concern from the Philippines.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Sunico, for that fantastic intervention there. I think you raised a number of key points. It was really great to hear about the experiences from the Philippines, and many congratulations again on the Lifelong Learning Development Framework Act. Tying it also to the Lifelong Learning Entitlements concept, it was great to hear about the grants that TESDA is providing when it comes to job-specific sectors, but also this interest in aligning lifelong learning policy at the national level with LLLEs. So really many thanks once again, especially I know it's quite late in the Philippines now, so thank you for that really rich
Our
presentation.
pleasure, Miss Katie.
Thank you. And also just to say, it's brilliant to see the ongoing commitment of the Philippines to advancing lifelong learning policy and LLLEs. I think your dedication and passion for this really came through very clearly in the capacity building workshop. So thank you again to you and colleagues for your excellent collaboration and engagement in that context. Now, just looking at the time, unfortunately, we really will not have much of a space for Q&A today. I do see some excellent questions have been coming in. But I do hope that we will have other spaces to be able to dive into this topic a lot more. I think it's an increasingly relevant topic. So very much hoping we will have further spaces for exchange on that. And before handing over to Raul for the closing, I would just like to say a big thank you to all who contributed to this discussion today, to Boren, to Michael, Claudia, and Mr. Sunico, as well as to all participants for their engagement. Also, a big thank you to all colleagues from UIL and UNESCO headquarters for their roles in co-organising and promoting this session. So Raul, Katja and Kirsten on UIL's end, and also Claudia, Allegra, Mara, Wenhui, Yale, Hervé and Boren on the side of UNESCO headquarters. So to close our session, I'm very pleased to hand over the floor to Mr. Raul Valdez-Cotera, who is Chief Programme Coordinator at the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Raul.
Katie, thank you very much. It was really nice to hear the different interventions. And as we bring today's webinar to a close, I also would like to thank all of you, our speakers, colleagues at the UNESCO headquarters. Always nice to work together on this very exciting topic. From UIL also, thank you very much, and all of you participants for your valuable contribution to this session. The active engagement reflects our common vision that lifelong learning is not only a policy priority, but really a human right that must be realized for all. As we face rapid digitalization, the climate crisis, demographic change, and other global challenges, the need to promote inclusive lifelong learning opportunities is more important than ever before. And it is in this context that the relevance of lifelong learning entitlements that is very clear. As we have seen and listened today, lifelong learning entitlements are key for helping us to ensure every individual has the right to access learning opportunities throughout life, regardless their age, their background, their occupation. Lifelong learning entitlements are not abstract ideals. Rather, they are practical mechanisms, from individual learning accounts and vouchers to subsidies and tax incentives. As we heard earlier, these are already helping to make learning portable, inclusive, and responsive to rapidly shifting labor market demands. Over the hour, we heard of success stories and great achievements. We learned about high lifelong learning entitlements initiatives have been able to engage different target groups and the importance of ensuring clear practical approaches when designing entitlements. We also consider challenges that we should keep in mind looking ahead, from quality assurance, as Michael was mentioning, issues and challenges related to inclusion. The fraud risk was also quite an important topic. I warmly congratulate the authors of this publication being celebrated today, as well as our colleagues at UNESCO headquarters, whose dedication and extensive research have brought this useful research to life. I'm certain that the publication will be incredibly valuable in supporting policymakers and practitioners worldwide in their efforts to promote accessible, relevant lifelong learning opportunities. Importantly, today's discussion connects to the ongoing capacity building workshop series on lifelong learning policy development that we are promoting together with UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, together with Shanghai Open University. And for several years, this series has been supporting representatives from UNESCO member states in different parts of the world to design effective lifelong learning policies and implementation strategies. Our workshops are being reflected how lifelong learning has been increasingly recognized by policymakers as a critical factor for sustainable development. And looking ahead, it will be interesting to see how we can align lifelong learning entitlements with national level lifelong learning policies to a greater extent. Definitely, we will use this material as part of our capacity building workshops. And you can see some results on the presentation of Philippines today from Florencio. I think it's super relevant how Philippines has been advancing in already developing a policy on lifelong learning. Well, given its relevance to today's discussion, I would also like to mention the forthcoming 6th Global Report on Adult Learning and Education, the GRAIL 6, to be published in 2027. This aims to explore how adult learning and education can respond and shape rapid transformation occurring globally. Together, these initiatives, the publication that we celebrate today, the workshops that we have been working on, and GRAIL 6 remind us that our work is part of a sustained effort that links vision to action and that strengthens lifelong learning across the globe. As we end today's events, let us carry forward the spirit of partnership, of solidarity that we have been seeing during this webinar. Let us continue to champion lifelong learning as a human right and to build ecosystems that empower every learner everywhere. Thank you once again for your participation, for your contributions, and for your commitment to making lifelong learning a reality for all. Thank you and wish you the best. Bye.